First of all, Martin, your vision for migrating from a specialized hardware environment to something where applications are developed completely in the cloud with the cloud in mind was pretty compelling. But how does that strategy right now line up how does that line up with the market forces that these service providers are having to deal with?
I think it lines up very well is the answer. I mean, I think one of the things to remember is that your prime competition, the people that you should be most worried about, are the over-the-top providers. And the over-the-top providers have been very smart about the way they've leveraged cloud. So for example, Viber, which is one of the well-known over-the-top voice over IP providers, leverages Amazon Cloud for its entire subscriber database. So they're using cloud to get cost out of their business, and they're able to run services that are essentially free, with a business model we don't yet quite understand. But one of the reasons they can do that is because those services are very inexpensive to run, and they're inexpensive to run because they're leveraging cloud creatively.
Phil, my response to that as well is just coming back to what I said earlier. For me, the essence of this is flexibility. Right. Part of what we're trying to do here is empower our customers to be as flexible as they want to be. And the analogy I draw is if you go back to the early days of the Metaswitch platform, we've always had a very, very strong focus on IP and on driving towards next generation networks, but we've never mandated a timetable or a template for any of our customers. We've always said, you move at your own pace. Mm-hmm. And I think the essence of this is all about flexibility along the spectrum that Martin talked about. We're going to have customers who will continue to want to run dedicated hardware depending on their requirements, or have a mix. And we're going to have other ones who are going to want to move quicker because it's the right thing for their business. And I think we can provide them with a very flexible migration.
To pivot away from the technology discussion just for a second, what are the implications of his technology strategy on Metaswitch as a company? Because he's describing a very different type of company, maybe, in a couple of years. You're not having specialized hardware that doesn't require as many people. Yeah. What sort of company are you building?
Well, I think we have always viewed ourselves as a software company. And what's interesting for me is if I look back over the development of all of the hardware platforms that we've built over the last 10 years, we've never had a hardware team that's been more than 10 or 15 people. So we've always taken the approach that we shouldn't build proprietary hardware. We should base it on industry standard components, whether they're DSPs or network processors. And the vast bulk of our engineering team has always been a software team. So from my perspective, it just carries on with that tradition. I think it does introduce interesting challenges in terms of business model. And we're thinking quite hard about what the business model and the pricing and how all of that's going to work as we move in this direction. But my sense is that the path we take there will actually match the needs of our customers very well, because they're having to think about how they work in a much more cost-effective way.
When you're, do you have anything to add to that, or you're?
No. Okay. No. John said it nicely.
When you're talking about, there's been some volleying back and forth in the telco space. So I wanted to get you two to weigh in on this idea of, should service providers be focused on providing the best bandwidth, the lowest cost per bit, or do they need to get into developing specialized applications of their own to set themselves apart, to deliver to small businesses, things like that? Because we've had all these sort of, and I'm not talking really about, I guess hosted PBX is sort of in that area, but there are so many other things, like when we talk about HD voice and video, high-res video conferencing, those are excellent applications that I just don't see a lot of people using in the real world. And so I wonder, are the next applications really going to come from your service provider customers? Are they going to come from you? Or should the platform just sort of be there and let them come from Google or whoever?
Well, I think we've got to be clear about, what is the foundation of a telco's business long term? And certainly in the fixed line business, the loop is always going to be there. DSL is going to be the most cost-effective way of getting broadband to the vast majority of people. And of course, as we know, the regulatory regime is shifting towards broadband as the kind of universal service as opposed to POTS. So if we take broadband as a given, that's the foundation of the business. And ultimately, over-the-top providers can't take that away from telcos.
Right.
Telcos have an opportunity to sell value-added services that leverage that connectivity. And the PSTN is certainly one of those services. Kind of enhanced voice services, HD voice, with the addition of video, the addition of messaging. Clearly that's the sort of realms where the OTT guys are starting to compete. But the thing is that these are customers that you telcos have to lose. I mean, they're your customers right now, and you owe it to yourselves to think about, well, what services do I have to introduce? Maybe alongside POTS, not necessarily replacing POTS, but alongside POTS that keep people interested in what I have to offer, that continue to make me relevant to my subscriber base, where maybe they won't pay as much as they used to for POTS, but they will pay something for the reassurance of the quality of the service, for the fact that it comes from a trusted partner, and the simple convenience that it's all bundled with one bill. It's one identity, one phone number that people know me on. I don't have to have a separate subscription and a separate business relationship with some other provider. So the bundling effect is very real. So it's all about figuring out, okay, what can I deliver over my pipes that will keep me relevant and continue to generate revenue, accepting that the attrition in fixed line telephony is going to continue.
I mean, I think your question is a really great question, and actually goes to the heart of the challenges that the industry faces that I was talking about earlier. I mean, I do think for all of the service providers in this room, there are over-the-top providers coming really hard. And if you just look at voice, you look at video, you look at WhatsApp in the messaging space, et cetera, there's no doubt that those people are moving quickly. They are driving down revenues for those services as they were previously delivered. So for any service provider to sit there complacently is just dumb. I don't think anybody in this room is actually doing that. So then, as Martin says, you get into the game of working out what are your assets, what do you actually have in terms of core infrastructure, customer relationships, and how do you leverage those? I do think, and maybe this is a controversial thing to say, I do think there are going to be a subset of service providers who will potentially just become data pipe providers because they literally cannot defend themselves.
Yeah.
Or they decide that that's where they're
better. Or they decide that that's actually a great business. And then our job, hence me just opening the kimono on SDN, is to make them potentially the best data pipe provider that they can be.
Yeah, so I mean, that is an interesting thing, because I think that with a lot of the messaging service providers they get this feeling sometimes, or at least a couple of them were telling me last night, that they get this feeling that every time a new application comes along, they feel they need to be in that business. Now I have to build this. And like what you said, I don't think that's necessarily the case. They have to decide which applications mean the most to their customers. And sometimes that's not easy to do when something first arrives, makes a lot of noise, and is sort of getting headlines and stuff.
I mean, the one thing I would say about this group of customers is we've been doing this for 10 years now, and every year I'm incredibly amazed by the level of innovation and entrepreneurship that actually happens from within this group. So I wouldn't write these people off just yet.
Yeah. No. I just want to quickly point out that I have something that, I don't have an iPad yet, but I have this incredibly high resolution display that's right here. And I can do instant messaging on it as well. I can write things and hand them off. And so let me refer back to my device here. So we did talk a little bit about software-defined networking and the direction you're going there. I'm hitting it because it's a hot topic and everyone sort of wants to know, how does this even relate? So what do you think beyond the data center? What do you think the future of software-defined networking is as it relates to what services you're providing?
I mean, to give an example of a kind of new revenue-generating opportunity, instant virtual private networking on demand, perhaps even invoked by an API. So you can imagine an enterprise with its own data center, but also handing traffic off to some third-party cloud computing facility. And maybe it's doing some big data analytics or something like that, and it needs to be able to transfer terabytes of data across a link for a relatively short period of time. Now, it wouldn't want to lease that amount of bandwidth all the time.
Right.
But you can imagine the idea of having an API that allows it to request so many gigabits of bandwidth into the cloud for some period of time and then drop it at the end and then get billed for that. That's the kind of thing that you can do with software-defined networking, which today, you couldn't do because it would require manual provisioning, maybe even right down to the optical, Lambda sort of layer, which just is just too hard to do.
A good use case example of that would be somebody like Netflix or somebody doing content delivery. Mm-hmm. So maybe doing video on demand, and they suddenly get a really, really big peak in a particular geographic area where there's a whole bunch of people in that area wanting to see a film. What they want is a local cache. What they don't want to do is pre-provision the cache. They want to set it up for that evening for 12 hours and then drop the cache at the end.
Let it go. Yeah.
So that's the kind of use case which I think is very, very compelling. I think what we bring to the party is absolutely awesome knowledge of the optical layer and also the MPLS layer. So my particular take in on this is where I think we can really, really make a difference is having a control plane in a centralized cloud environment that potentially touches right down to the optical layer. And that's, we have a lot of partnerships in the space that we can work with.
Well, I know you guys are doing a lot of work in the OIF and talking a lot. I've seen a lot of presentations about your work on the control plane. And I'll revisit that in a second. I wanted to hit a business question here as we're getting close to wanting to opening up for Q&A, for more Q&A, I should say. You mentioned in your presentation, John, about that the company is now going to renew its focus on VoIP infrastructure. Just as a curiosity, do you feel it lost its focus in that space, or can you maybe characterize what's different about going forward than has been in the last couple of years?
No, I don't think we lost our focus on VoIP infrastructure. I think what I was saying today is we're just making sure that people understand that that commitment still stays and we renew it. And I do think it's an absolutely fundamental part of our business, which we just have to keep on moving forward. I do think we probably lost a little bit of focus on the hosted business space, as I said this morning. And that's somewhere where I'm trying very hard to make sure that we renew that and we do better.
How do you see yourselves lining up competitively against a company like Genband, which has been had phenomenal growth, made a lot of acquisitions. They have a lot of gear under one banner in a lot of different service provider networks. And so that could be a problem, but it's also a market advantage in that now they get to call on those service providers. And
Yep.
I mean, how do you see yourselves competing and lining up against those guys?
Well, they're obviously a formidable competitor, and I respect them greatly. I know Charlie, and I don't underestimate them for a minute. I do think that I'm never scared of competition with Genband. I think that our product set maps very, very well against them. I think that doing acquisitions at a breakneck speed and absorbing them and creating cohesion out of everything that they've taken on is a difficult task to accomplish. And I think that we, certainly in terms of software engineering, can differentiate ourselves. But they are formidable, and they're obviously an incumbent vendor in a huge number of places. So, that's an obstacle that we understand, and we're very prepared for the challenge. Anything you want to add to that, Martin?
No, I think you've said it nicely.
How does, going back to the control plane discussion just real quick, I've seen it demoed a couple of times, but I've yet to see a situation where there's an implementation of a multi-vendor control plane in a service provider network that's generating revenue and all that. Why haven't we seen that to date, and is that coming soon? What's sort of holding that back? Because I also see that as like something that would not only give you guys, an advantage, but would also sort of pay off on this promise of having, networks that are more flexible, more agile, and that sort of thing.
I mean, lack of standards has been one of the big things. So, I mean, there are a couple of things that have been going on in the standards bodies that we see as not the whole answer, but important ingredients to opening up networks for software-defined networking. One is the path computation element concept. So, within an MPLS network, being able to have some central intelligence that can compute the end-to-end path with knowledge of overall network topology and program the nodes for the label switching path end-to-end. That's one element. So that's a standardized way of kind of end-to-end topology and path computation. And then OpenFlow, which is a kind of very radical dumbing down of the router, an extraction of almost all of the intelligence into a centralized place, and essentially relegating the router to a sort of dumb data forwarding element, a little bit like soft switching actually, but with all the routing intelligence in a central place. Now, again, it's not the whole answer, because if we're talking about multiple layers, lambdas and optical transport networks and MPLS and so on. But those two starting points are good places to start, and we think the standards are going to carry on evolving, and we think that's key to opening up the networks to multi-vendor centralized control planes and provisioning.
Okay. Real quick, let's go to the audience. Does anybody have questions? We have microphones set up in the aisles. Just walk up and say your piece or ask something, or while you're making your way to the microphone, I do have another question for John about, this is more about running a company generally. It's curious to me because you're stepping back in the CEO spot, in the driver's seat, as you say. How do you balance keeping your head down, focusing on the job, keeping the company moving forward, and this new, relatively new temptation to be completely connected on social networks, being available for these guys, being, sort of, you have a lot, it seems like, there's always a balance between the inside and the outside of a company, but the outside has gotten so much bigger and louder and more connected over the years. How do you maintain that balance as you're running a company?
Well, if somebody's got the answer to that, please come and talk to me. Yeah, with difficulty. I do ration myself. And I think everybody who's in a job like mine has to absolutely do that. So, if anybody in my team sends me an email and then sends me another email in half an hour saying, "Why haven't you responded?" then I do get rather angry. I do think you have to. I find all of the inputs actually very useful as long as I manage myself to filter them properly. I'm a great fan of Twitter. As one example, just because it's an absolutely fantastic source of news for me. So, following some of the people who are even here, and in fact, Dean's standing at the microphone, he's one of the people I will follow, because I'll get news from him. I use that as a way of really keeping myself as current as possible. But I think it's a huge battle, and I do think the danger for all of us is we just get fragmented in our attention spans. Mm-hmm.
Anything to add? You're in the. Let's
go
ahead and go to the Q&A.
Turn the microphone over to Dean.
All right, Dean.
I'm sure he's got a question.
You have a question?
Hi, thanks. Really interesting about some of the cloud-based moves we talked about before. Once communications services start to be instantiated in the cloud, does it make it easier for carriers, service providers, to innovate independently rather than collaboratively with hundreds of their peers trying to thrash out standards for new services? Can they get more advantage acting solo? For example, I've just seen that Japanese operator Docomo has a bunch of cloud voice services like translation and cloud storage of voice and this sort of thing. So is that the direction we're going to be going?
Well, I think that cloud certainly puts more power in the hands of service providers. And let's remember that one of the ways that the over-the-top guys have been able to innovate so quickly is they've not been held back by standards. Now, and they've owned the whole thing. So they've owned the software in the core. They've owned the endpoints. You look at Skype, for example. It's an end-to-end. It's completely closed. I think that approach generally is anathema to telcos. They find that a really, really hard thing to work with. So, SIP is here to stay and is now matured to the point where I think it does most of the things that telcos need it to do from the point of view of voice, video, and messaging services. So I think, if we just take SIP as the kind of given, and then say, right, now you've got the cloud out there as a place to house software where if your service takes off, and let's remember that cloud allows you to go out of region with no boundaries, then you can scale out incredibly quickly. Now, probably most of our customers here have got relatively limited resources when it comes to innovating in their own right, but many of them also are good at sharing ideas with us and encouraging us to put those ideas into practice. So, I think cloud does improve the velocity of innovation, and it allows you to leverage success much more quickly because of the ability to scale out and scale geographically.
I would just say two things there as well, just to add to what Martin said. Number one is, I do think it potentially encourages individual innovation, but I firmly believe there's some really big collaborative opportunities there. So for example, I could see situations where people within a region might choose to share session border control in the cloud as a way of really leveraging cloud-based services. That's one. Second is, if we get the platform direction right and we do have good APIs, then there's no reason why a community of developers, potentially from within the service providers as a group, but also beyond, can be developing services which multiple people can deploy. The analogy would be the Android application development environment. So I think there's ways where it actually opens up collaboration quite powerfully.
Next question. Go ahead.
My name is Sam Kumar. I'm the president of Microtechtel in Denver, Colorado. And the access, the layer one business, we think is a dead business because the prices keeps coming down and the cable companies are selling bandwidth for ridiculously low price, which doesn't make sense at all. So having said that, one of the opportunities we are chasing is the hosted PBX across the country. And we can deliver that using Metaswitch from our data center in Denver, Colorado. However, if you create instances of Metaswitch in the cloud and control it with the software-defined network, is that a better model that you envision? Or we can still get by with one or two Metaswitches in another location?
I think it's quite difficult to generalize around these things. I think everyone has got to do the job of looking at all of their costs for running their own operation out of their own data center, off their own hardware, with their own people, and then comparing that with running the software in the cloud, and just see how it pans out. Now, it just totally depends on the structure of your own business, what skill sets you've got, what your operational costs are, what they look like. It is very difficult to generalize. But I think one thing we can say is that from the point of view of buying the raw computing power that you need to power the services that we're talking about, the cloud ultimately is going to be the most economical place to get that computing power. But how it applies to any individual business, I think each of us has that obligation to figure that out.
I was looking for your vision of these Metaswitch instances in the cloud at multiple different locations controlled by software-defined network.
So I think it depends which cloud you're actually talking about there. If you're talking about running instances of our software in a completely public cloud, like an Amazon or Google cloud, my answer to that is, under the covers, they're already using a version of SDN to actually control their networks. So these are proprietary versions, potentially based on OpenFlow originally, but Amazon and Google already do that between all of the data centers. So to some extent, you're getting that for free. The more interesting question is if you build your own cloud or your own data centers and you want to have a network underneath that. And yes, in the future, we're not ready for this. We're only talking about product coming out in at least a year away. We may be in a position to facilitate that.
Okay. Thanks for the question. Let's keep it moving. Let's take one more, and then we're about out of time on this segment. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Joe Pilcher, Databo. I got a question in terms of quality of service. I think sooner or later we will all be both facilities-based carriers as well as over-the-top. The line is getting gray now. We're having to be on both sides. Now with mobility, with facilities that may not come up to scratch in terms of access, the fact that you have video coming into the picture more and more. How are we going to guarantee QoS to our customers? Be they over the top, be they on our facilities. I think we talk of VoIP, it was right here and quality was there. But I hear horror stories all the time in terms of customers leaving, providers because QoS is becoming so much of an issue.
Yes, I mean, I suspect that actually the cable industry has done a slightly better job of this than the telco industry. It's hard for me to say that, but it is. I think it's true. Certainly, managing the access point is pretty important. So, if you've got the ability to manage the DSL router, I mean, most DSL routers have got reasonably good QoS capabilities in them. They just need turning on and managing. In the downstream direction, usually there's enough bandwidth for it not to matter too much. But again, there are QoS capabilities in DSL access routers, which are many times just not being exploited. So, I do think it is up to telcos to start looking at what the QoS capabilities that they've got in the network that they may be underexploiting, and putting in place plans to make sure that they leverage what they've got to the best possible advantage.
I do think there are also advances in some of the codecs, which are potentially hugely helpful there. I'll give you just a personal example. I was at an airport in North America on a really, really bad Wi-Fi connection. And I was using, I'm just going to do a plug for one of our products here, but I was using one of our Accession clients running on Android. And obviously this is using Silk as a modern codec. And I called my wife at home in the UK, and I was completely blown away by the quality of the call running over what was a very intermittent Wi-Fi network. So I think we're beginning to get technology that is adaptive to much more intermittent IP networks, which is going to be very helpful moving forward. But your point is a really, really good one. I mean, overall, that is a big issue, and that's why I kind of emphasized it in the talk this morning, because I do think we need to be worrying about it.
Okay, I think we should wrap up and invite Steve back up. Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.